Okay, so health versus disease. Let's look at some definitions. Well, first of all, I mean, what is health?
What is health?
What is health?
Right.
Right, yes. The world, in other words, the allopathic view is the absence of something to fight. Okay? Within that philosophical paradigm. Homeopathy would probably say the presence of everything supported. Okay? So, what is health? Well, this is perhaps the most cynical definition. The slowest possible way in which to die. Okay? And here's Mosby's definition. Physical, mental, social well-being, absence of disease, or other abnormal conditions, not static. There's constant change and adaptation to stress in homeostasis. Okay, so that could be, I mean, that starts encapsulating certain aspects, but it's very materialist in its perspective. Disease, also from Mosby's medical dictionary, condition of abnormal vital function, structure, system of an organism, or a specific illness or disorder characterized by a specific set of signs, symptoms, etc., and that could or needn't be attributed to a certain cause. I think those are fairly deficient definitions. I'm not pretending that mine are really much better, but at least they're somewhat broader, and they try to bring in the other areas of dysfunction in spirit, soul, and body. So, for me, consistent with, I would say, the biblical view is that health and wholeness are related. Because death is ultimately separation of wholeness. You know, when we dissociate from our body, which is the ultimate separation, that constitutes death. So the process of incremental separation would then be disease. Breakdown. So the product of wholeness, of spirit, soul, and body, in which purpose, in other words, that to me is an expression of spiritual homeostasis. If purpose is supported through its different functional underpinnings, if meaning, which is at the level of the soul, is supported, and if the mechanisms of life are aligned and mutually supportive for sustainable, autonomous existence, with sufficient resilience. I know it's technical, but if you bear with me, the terms, you'll see what I'm trying to say. With sufficient resilience for recovery from exertion or perturbations or transient intrusions. So what I'm saying is, spirit, soul, and body works as it should. You can maintain it independently, although that doesn't pretend you can live on your own, and that you've got enough maneuverability that short-term disturbances, either in energy expenditure or things that intrude on your physiology, or maybe a disturbance of your physiology, is not going to catapult you into dysfunction or dissociation. So this moves integration into health. Because if wholeness is health, then integration in that sense of spirit, soul, and body is a state of health. Disintegration is therefore a form of disease. And in fact, our healthcare profession is sick because it's disintegrated. Disease, therefore, is the opposite. So it's the loss of that wholeness. And why I've done it this way is because it just gives us a broader perspective. It gives us language that at least tries to touch on those areas. Now, if we look at what is called successful aging, and successful aging is actually a known concept in which you die of old age. To use the analogy of a fruit, the fruit can fall from the tree without rotting. Okay, you don't need a disease to die. You can literally have senescence or aging of cells to the point where they no longer function. You don't need to have a disease. You don't need to have a process of corruption. You can literally have wear and tear, ultimately grinding to a halt. And that's well understood. And there are many biblical examples, and of course there are many secular examples of what is assumedly, literally, old age. Not necessarily a stroke or a heart attack. They just ultimately had a heart that stopped beating. Now, normal aging doesn't look like that. It's the sort of squiggly line between health and sickness until at some stage around 40, there's some sort of chronic illness that starts keeling you over until you dissociate or die. So that is what is called normal aging, believe it or not. There are many opportunities for premature departures, of course, traumatic, infective, substance, many ways in which people can die too early. So therefore, the question that we're really asking when it comes to this is, what is going to promote people towards successful aging? And the opposite, what is going to drive disease? So what is going to promote the dissociation, or what is going to promote wholeness? And if that is our focus, we're going to have a broader perspective on health and illness than just the mechanisms of dealing with pathogens and so on. Now, let me frame that within the health profession itself. Especially from a allopathic point of view, although I'm going to try and put everyone in here. I don't think I'm the most qualified to speak on that, of course, but let me try. This is where we start. We presume that a pathogen, an agent that makes you sick, a predisposition, something that makes you vulnerable to sickness, or pathophysiological process, a disturbance leading to a worsening situation, ultimately becomes an ongoing derangement, which we call a disorder, or a specific ongoing process of dysfunction, which we might call a disease. And then we study those in order to produce a therapeutic solution. Now, those solutions fit into three categories. You either oppose the disease, or you support the patient, or you block the pathway. I mean, those are philosophically the three strategies. You are against the disease, cut it out, dry it up, kill it, poison it, whatever. That is allopathic. Homeopathic means we're supporting the patient. There's a paradoxical approach in which infinitesimal dilutions of an agent that should actually provoke the symptoms is applied, and it somehow has the mechanism of supporting the patient, and there is randomized controlled trial evidence that that approach does work in certain circumstances. So the observation of homeopathy having an effect is undeniable. If we're looking at the effect is undeniable. It's not just all in the mind, it's demonstrable even in randomized controlled trials. So anti-disease or pro-health approaches both work. And alternative medicine, and of course that's a very broad spectrum, but alternative medicine, whether it's acupuncture, magnets, or anything related to the energy spectrum, presumes to interrupt what is driving the malfunction. In other words, it tries to interrupt the flow from spirit, soul to body. That's actually what it tries to do. Now, the concept of meridians are scientifically valid. I don't know whether you knew that. There's a study that has actually shown that radiopaque dye that is injected into a limb does distribute in a pattern that is essentially indistinguishable with what you would see in Chinese medicine. Okay? There is evidence for these microtubules to actually form and to transmit. We don't actually understand what it is, but they are there. Okay? So it's not a non-entity at all. The question, therefore, primarily is, does it actually work? And what are the side effects? Because that's how we value Western medicine. Now, in Western medicine, we seem to be quite content if the medication gives you a fatal anaphylactic shock and death. That is an acceptable risk we're willing to take. On the energy spectrum, we're very concerned about the spiritual infections that may happen. Okay. But can you see the hypocrisy in that? You know, we say, well, the body's dispensable, so, if that has a complication, that's fine. Spiritually, well, we don't want to go anywhere near that. The irony is that Western medicine will sometimes be quite happy to sacrifice a person's spiritual beliefs in order to give them an expedient physical solution. The extreme example would be the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses, and I'm not arguing in favor of what they believe, what I'm saying is that they believe if you receive another person's blood, you are damned to hell. That's the belief. Now, it is possible to get a court order in order to resuscitate an underage child of Jehovah's Witnesses and force the situation of administering blood. And we have, from a mechanistic point of view, been very successful in taking care of the foolish parents' spiritual beliefs, and we, with our materialist wisdom, have now been able to save the life of the child. What we don't even contend with is that the spiritual consequences that we have just damned their child to hell. But we aren't sued in court for spiritual complications. Right? So we can be spiritually negligent, but you dare not be physically negligent. Can you see the hypocrisy? And all I'm pointing out is that we need a broader perspective than we've had. Okay, so this is on the sort of material physical level. We have interventions, but more and more the West is catching up with the East and realizing that your thoughts or your mind relates to your body. And we are, through disciplines like psychoneuroimmunology or psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, they keep adding organs, we are starting to study the mechanisms of how neuropeptides, how different effects related to our thoughts, the molecules of emotion, Candace Pert's work, etc., how that provides some sort of mechanism that responds to meaning. We're finding the biological links between meaning and mechanism. Okay? The problem is, what do we do with this? Well, that fits in the area of meaning, so we farm it out to the people that have to do with the mental philosophies. Now, psychiatry, of course, for various reasons, has moved more into the biologies, so it uses drugs more and more and more, and the talk therapies less and less and less. And in fact, is starting to embrace a lot of spiritual therapies as an extension of soul therapy, if you want to call it that, which is what psychology is meant to be. The dilemma is that it either ignores the entity of the soul by pretending everything is a chemical, or it imposes a different worldview in an effort to make symptoms more tolerable. Let me use a contrasting statement. In other words, a psychologist might say, well, you've got a good side and a bad side. The bad side needs to be suppressed, and you need to make peace with it, and you therefore just need to concentrate on the good things. And your life is miserable, but have a positive attitude. Okay? So, and it gives you the skills to deal with that. Now, I don't mean to be critical of it. I'm trying to give you perspectives. Okay? And when it does that, it often imposes a completely non-biblical worldview. In other words, in order to overcome guilt, it will promote hedonism. In other words, don't feel guilty about all the things you enjoy. Go and have fun, go and bust out, go and do whatever you want. So it will sometimes, in an effort to try and compensate for an intrinsic misunderstanding maybe, or malalignment, or maybe the damage that's done in family or community, it will go outside the principles that the person may have been raised in and offer an alternative interpretation of the world. So it gives you new meaning to try and fix the underlying problem. And it becomes very confusing, and it becomes very contradictory, and mostly, not always of course, but mostly people who reach that critical stage of mental health, when they are in the offices of psychologists or psychiatrists, change their faith orientation. It's very common. You can look at the statistics. Okay? I'm not saying that's always a bad thing necessarily, but what I am saying is that their worldview is challenged, because the intrinsic worldview in psychology is get a grip, fix it yourself, here are the tools. Okay? And that determines, or that drives the process differently. In other words, it's up to you. Now let me contrast maybe in an idiom that would be useful for you. We know from a spiritual point of view you're supposed to read your Bible. Okay? That's the spiritual food. In the physical world, you're supposed to have a Bible. But you know what? You also need to learn to read. Okay? So there is the spiritual aspect, there's the physical aspect, but there's also the skill aspect. And skill is a soul-based approach. So teaching people skills, interpersonal skills, taking thoughts captive, renewal of the mind, being renewed by the spirit of your mind, all those things are psychology. They're skills, they're training, and we do need them. The question is that training ultimately going to bring better alignment and physiology between spirit, soul, and body? Or is it going to create a process of temporary relief at the expense of ultimate wholeness? Peace, peace, not like the world gives sort of thing, okay? So that's the issue, is are these people equipped to align spirit, soul, and body in a consistent way? And therein lies the challenge. And because the communities of faith have sometimes been very superstitious, the psychological therapists have become very arrogant. Okay? And it's been very difficult to come up with a mechanism in which you have a biblical worldview maintained within mental illness related conditions. It's really one of the big missing pieces. Okay. Now, most people have a transcendent, eternal, spiritual worldview. And we are increasingly understanding that there is something driving us beyond the level of the brain or thought, if you like. But who deals with that? Well, typically it would be spiritual leaders and elders, but they no longer believe, other than applying oil and prayer, which may or may not work in their experience if they're honest. Beyond that point, the management of illness is passed on to the health professions. And the health professional may be a scientist who actually imposes or proselytizes the person to atheism. He says, you know, there's all this demons and stuff, but you know what? You've just got arthritis in your foot. You know, get a grip, it's molecules. You've got too much uric acid. Okay? And the problem is, if you do not understand mechanism, meaning, and purpose, if you cannot draw those through, you leave the person fragmented. You leave them fragmented and confused whether or not they realize or admit it. And therein lies tremendous risk, especially if it has to do with life or death illnesses. Okay, so one of the things I hope to do with what I am doing is to re-empower, re-equip, essentially bring confidence back to spiritual leaders to have authority in areas related to mental health and biological illness, so that there's alignment for good. Now, just to show you how weird our therapies have been, some of you have seen this slide. 2000 BC, eat this root. So plants were our medicines. Then 1000 BC, it's heathens say this prayer. 3000 years later, the prayer superstition, drink the potion. 100 years later, the potion snake oil, swallow the pill. Then the pill is ineffective, take the antibiotic. The antibiotic's artificial, eat this root. So you can see how we've really come full circle, even though our motivations may have changed. And the reality is that unless we have a full picture, it's only going to work for a period of time. It's not sustainable. Something that is incorrect is never eternal. If it's not perfect, it's not going to last. Or as a friend of mine says, if it has legs, it'll walk. Okay? If it won't, it'll be temporary. So it's a bit like the drunk man standing at the lamppost looking for his coin. In the middle of the night, a boy coming up to him and saying, "What you doing?" He says, "Well, I lost my coin." And he says, "Well, I'll help you look." And he spends a bit of time there. And after about half an hour, he says, "Well, are you sure you lost your coin here?" And he says, "Oh, no. I lost it in the dark alley over there, but the light is better here." Okay? And in a way, that's what science does. In other words, we look where the light is. We look what we can observe. And now we're making upstream assumptions which we aren't able to really test. But because we feel we insist we should, we pretend that the light is all there is. And that's harmful and ultimately flawed. And as I said, there have been multiple theories and strategies to deal with this. Psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology basically says that the brain and the different organs of the body have a two-way communication, and it's influenced by our state of mind. Genetic research is now moving into the area of epigenetics, which is saying that how you're nurtured, your lifestyle and other things influences how your genetic code is expressed. Using an analogy that might be easier to understand, if my arm is the genetic code, epigenetics is the sleeve. So essentially how we live, how we're conditioned, our nutrition, exercise, all these things influence how the genetic code is expressed and therefore what is transcribed. And it's well known, it's heritable, and it seems to be a very, very good link between, for instance, lack of nurture and subsequent metabolic diseases. I mean, there are now mechanisms that are relatively easy to show. We don't fully understand how they work, but at least it's something that we can point and say, oh, that's epigenetic. And one of the models that tries to bring everything together is called functional medicine. And functional medicine says there's some basic root causes that are partially genetic, they're partially spiritual, they're partially this, they're partially what you eat, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Those cause 11 core imbalances, including degeneration, inflammation, oxidation, some of the mitochondrial diseases, some of the common pathways of disease, which ultimately produce the fruit of disease that you can give a name to, attribute symptoms to, and typically have a regimen of treatment for. But managing at that level is very expensive. Managing at this level is completely unfunded. And therein lies the problem. Because that's break-in insurance medicine, and that's mowing your lawn. And our healthcare models don't work on mowing the lawn. That's your responsibility. And therein lies the schism in so many areas of healthcare. So in our elusive pursuit, we're back to what Einstein called insanity, doing the same things but expecting different results. And it simply is not going to work that way. Now I'm just briefly going to run through this and show you that the way we often think about health preservation or restoration or deterioration, we have concepts called risk, exposure, response, and recovery. In other words, you're exposed to a risk, maybe a pathogen, bacteria, virus, radiation, some agent. Depending on the level of exposure, how many viruses you took in, where they came in contact with them, how much the dose of radiation was, you then have a response from the body in how it deals with it, repairs it, responds to it, inflames or whatever, and then a variable rate of recovery. So those are 4 steps. There's a risk, there's exposure, there's a response, and there is or isn't a recovery. So those are dynamics that we see. And of course, those could be summarized as a health risk, a health threat, the defense, and the healing process. Those we would call the disorders or diseases, and this side you have the scarring or compensation. So there's more to disease than healing. Of course, you can now split it up, spirit, soul, and body, and each of these are vulnerable to those things. There's spiritual risks, there's spiritual exposure, there's spiritual responses, there's spiritual recovery or non-recovery. Our spirit can be fractured. Even in Scripture, if you look at the words related to Scripture, it's actually fascinating. All of them have to do with being constrained or frustrated. My spirit is vexed, my spirit is crushed, my spirit is pushed together. So it's basically that purpose drive of who I was meant to be, how I was supposed to live, what my purpose was, is being constrained. So all of those are containing descriptions. And there's damage that can come with that. If our spirit can be broken, then obviously it can be damaged. Psychiatry, the same. The risk related to relationships, the level of exposure, post-traumatic stress, for instance, the response to it. Those who put the stress response into the bigger picture of their lives don't get PTSD. Those who take it into the disgust area of the insula of the brain develop PTSD. So the response to that determines ultimately what the level of recovery or the mechanism of recovery is. And the same, of course, with the body, which is the part we're most familiar with. The dilemma is that we obviously have interactions between these going on as well. Sexual assault is physical, psychological, and spiritual. It's a denigrating, it's a dishonor. And you cannot just deal with it on a physical or on a psychological level. There is a spiritual impact, and denying it is not solving it. So psychiatry has sort of settled on psychoneuroimmunology, and between the spiritual and psychiatry, I would say that spiritual roots of disease is probably the closest we are at the moment. I'm not going to pretend that that's the ultimate answer, but at least it's starting to be honest about the problem. So now, I'd like to give you a framework in which to think about the therapies, a framework that allows us to plot them. In other words, a way in which we can place them in context in terms of how they address either the disease or the disease process. We can start by giving a disease a name. In other words, we presume that on the basis of its characteristics, it is a distinct entity, and we use the characteristics of the disease to classify it. That would be a categorical classification system. On the other side, we've got the relational process interactions, metabolism, the economy of the body, neuropeptide flow, hormone cycles, right? Those are processes. They're not categories. So it's in a different flavor. This we give a name to. That is a process, but they're on opposite sides. Then on the top, we've got natural consequences. In other words, whoops, it just happened to you. You were exposed, bit of pollution, nobody's fault, or maybe it was, but you can't point to them. It just sort of happened. On the other side, someone's out to get you. It's personal. Now with that framework, the fancy names, categorical because we give it a category. That's relational because the factors interact. That's naturalistic, meaning it's just a process of the exposures of life. This is personalistic, which means that it is directed at you as a person. Now, if we look at our therapies, that's where conventional medicine sits. We give it a name, we say no one's to blame, and we come against whatever we think the agent is. Okay? We give it a name, and the naming gives us control. So the more specialized allopathic medicine comes, the more heavily it depends on giving names. Fits in that category. Chinese medicine is more over here. It's still mostly, it does acknowledge certain, spirits out to get you sort of thing in certain flavors of it. But much of it is actually about adaptogens and using herbs that are supposed to bring balance back. And there's scientific evidence that certain herbs do that. They bring balance back. So it assumes that no one's at fault, but it fixes the underlying process. It's not related to a specific entity. Do you see the difference? It's not a name, it's not a duck. It's a creature in the pond. Okay? It's something going on in the pond. So that sits there. Then we've got psychology that says, well, it's relational because it's between people. It's personalistic because it's between you and that person. So that sits over there. And to use a spiritual example, spiritual warfare sits here. We call it an unloving spirit, for instance, and it's out to get you, and you need to cast it out or undergo deliverance. So can you see these are different categories based on our understanding of disease? Now, here's an interesting thing. If you look at the Hebrew word for curse, it can either mean a specific agent that is put upon you, or it can be a natural consequences. It actually can contain both principles. So it actually works in both those models. It recognizes leprosy, but it also recognizes certain diseases that are just dysfunctional. So the Bible does not prescribe where a disease fits. It's got models for all of them. But Western medicine sits here. And now the pot's calling the kettle black. It's tricky, isn't it? So where I'm heading with this is we're going to need a different way of thinking. We're going to need to have a different approach. We can't give a therapy a name and everything that fits under that name is therefore evil. We're going to answer the very tricky question whether medicine is evil or not.